The icy wind of Christmas Eve whispered through the streets of New Haven, wrapping everything in a biting chill. Jack Foley, a seasoned thief who prided himself on his stealth, pulled his scarf tighter around his face. He surveyed the neighborhood with a practiced eye, scanning for a target that promised enough loot to get him through another bleak winter. Then he saw it. A house that seemed to glow with warmth and comfort, adorned with sparkling lights and a Christmas tree that towered in the front window, its ornaments gleaming like treasures. Jack approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow. He paused near the fence, eyeing the security system, or lack thereof, and smiled faintly. It was almost too easy. As he climbed over the fence, a faint bark broke the silence. He froze, heart pounding, listening for any signs of life. The barking stopped, replaced by a curious whine, and Jack relaxed. A dog wasn't an unusual obstacle, and he'd dealt with them before. With a quick glance around, he crept to the back door and began to work on the lock. Inside, the house was still and quiet, its inhabitants likely asleep upstairs. Jack moved swiftly, his gloved hands methodically searching drawers and shelves for valuables. His flashlight danced over family photos, stacks of unopened Christmas cards, and a half-eaten plate of cookies near the fireplace. He ignored them all, his focus on jewelry boxes, wallets, and anything small enough to carry but valuable enough to sell. Then he heard it, a soft padding of paws on hardwood floors. Jack turned sharply, his flashlight catching the reflective eyes of a golden retriever. The dog stood in the doorway, tail wagging slowly, head tilted in curiosity. Jack froze, waiting for the growl or bark that would shatter the quiet and bring the family running. But it never came. Instead, the dog trotted toward him, its tail wagging with a friendliness that caught Jack completely off guard. "Hey, no," Jack whispered, holding out a hand as if to keep the dog at bay. But the retriever, unfazed, nuzzled his palm, its warm nose brushing against his glove. Jack sighed, lowering his hand to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You're supposed to be guarding this place, you know." The dog, apparently oblivious to its failure as a guard, sat down next to Jack, leaning into his touch. Jack chuckled softly, despite himself. "Some watchdog you are." The interaction was unexpected, and it slowed Jack down. For a moment, he forgot about his mission, his eyes drawn to the dog's gentle demeanor. It reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, a time when life hadn't been so hard, perhaps when trust and kindness had been natural instead of foreign. Shaking off the thought, Jack resumed his search, the dog now trailing him like a loyal companion. It stayed silent, its presence both comforting and unnerving. Jack managed to find a small stash of jewelry in a bedroom upstairs, along with some cash tucked in a drawer. Satisfied, he tucked the loot into his bag and headed back downstairs, the retriever following close behind. At the back door, Jack hesitated. The dog looked up at him, its brown eyes full of an earnestness that made him feel uncomfortably exposed. "Stay," he murmured, stepping outside into the cold night. But as he turned to close the door, the dog darted through the gap, bounding out into the snow. Jack cursed under his breath, trying to shoo it back inside. But the retriever only wagged its tail and barked softly, as if inviting Jack to follow. "You can't come with me," Jack said, his voice low and firm. But the dog seemed to have other ideas. It stayed by his side as he walked away from the house, its paws crunching in the snow. Jack tried to outpace it, to scare it off, but the dog was relentless, sticking to him like glue. By the time Jack reached the edge of town, he was exasperated. "Fine," he muttered, turning to the dog, "but don't expect me to feed you or anything." The retriever responded with a happy bark, as if it had won a great victory. Together, they made their way to the abandoned warehouse Jack had been calling home. The place was a far cry from the cozy house they had left behind. Dim and drafty, it was cluttered with discarded furniture and piles of Jack's meager belongings. The dog sniffed around curiously, then settled on an old blanket in the corner, curling up as if it had lived there all its life. Jack watched it for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of annoyance and amusement. "You're a strange one," he said. The dog yawned, its eyes closing as it relaxed into sleep. Jack shook his head and sat down on a rickety chair, his bag of stolen goods at his feet. As he stared at the dog, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, an unease that had nothing to do with his crime. The quiet of the warehouse enveloped them, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Jack leaned back, his mind racing with the events of the night. The dog's unwavering trust had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He glanced at the sleeping animal and felt the faintest tug of guilt. For the first time in years, he wondered if there was still a part of him worth saving. Jack woke to the soft sounds of the golden retriever stirring in the corner of the warehouse. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. The cold draft from the cracked windows, the faint smell of damp wood, and the harsh reality of his surroundings quickly reminded him. The dog, Max, as he'd started calling him, looked at him expectantly, tail thumping lightly against the floor. "You're still here," Jack muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He didn't know why he'd expected otherwise. Max had been his shadow since they met, and nothing about the dog suggested it was going to change. Jack sighed, grabbed a crust of bread from his stash, and tossed it toward the dog. Max sniffed it, then nudged it with his nose before looking back at Jack with a disappointed expression. "Picky, huh? Well, that's all I've got." Jack leaned back against the wall, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in his own stomach. He hadn't eaten properly in days, and it was beginning to show in the way his hands shook and his thoughts felt sluggish. Max's steady gaze only made him feel worse. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't ask you to come along." Max tilted his head, as if to disagree, then patted over to Jack and rested his head on the man's knee. Jack froze. The simple gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that it took him off guard. He had no idea what this dog wanted from him. He wasn't used to kindness without strings attached. Days passed, and Jack adjusted to Max's presence, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. The dog had a way of making the cold, desolate warehouse feel a little less empty. Max would curl up beside him at night, his warmth a surprising comfort against the winter chill. Jack found himself talking to the dog more and more, sharing snippets of his past that he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "You know, I used to have a dog when I was a kid," Jack said one evening, staring into the dim light of a flickering candle. "Buddy, he was a mutt, but he was loyal as hell. Followed me everywhere, just like you do. He was all I had after my dad left and my mom." Jack trailed off, his throat tightening. He hadn't thought about Buddy in years. The memories were too tangled with pain and loss. Max nudged his hand, bringing him back to the present. Jack chuckled dryly, patting the dog's head. "You're a good listener. You know that?" The bond between them grew, but so did Jack's unease. He couldn't ignore the tag on Max's collar, engraved with the name Max and the contact information for the family he had robbed. Every time he saw it, a pang of guilt twisted in his gut. Jack knew he couldn't keep Max forever. He wasn't even sure he wanted to, but the thought of returning the dog to the family filled him with a strange sense of dread. They would know what he'd done. They'd see him for what he really was, a thief, a failure, a man who didn't belong. Still, the decision weighed on him. One morning, Jack took the small pile of jewelry he had stolen and laid it out on the rickety table in the corner. The pieces glinted in the weak light, mocking him with their beauty. He picked up a delicate gold bracelet, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't just about the money. It was about survival. But for the first time, Jack wondered if survival was enough. Max watched him from his spot on the floor, his head resting on his paws. Jack sighed, placing the bracelet back on the table. "What am I supposed to do, huh? Just waltz back there and say, 'Hey, I stole your stuff and your dog, but here you go?' They'd call the cops before I could get a word out." Max didn't respond, of course, but his steady gaze felt like judgment. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had spent so long running from consequences, convincing himself that the world had given up on him first. But Max's unwavering trust made him question everything. The turning point came unexpectedly. Jack was rummaging through a dumpster behind a diner, hoping to find something edible, when a small group of kids passed by. One of them, a girl no older than 10, spotted Max and ran over, her face lighting up with excitement. "Can I pet your dog?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, kid." The girl knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears and laughing when his tail wagged furiously. "He's so friendly. What's his name?" "Max," Jack said, the name slipping out before he could stop himself. The girl's smile faltered for a moment. "Max? That's funny. My neighbor's dog was named Max, and he looks just like this. But he's missing now. They've been looking for him everywhere." Jack felt his chest tighten. He forced a smile, his heart pounding. "Must be a common name." The girl shrugged, giving Max one last pat before running back to her friends. Jack stood frozen, watching her go. The guilt that had been simmering in the back of his mind now burned with a relentless intensity. He couldn't keep pretending this wasn't a problem. Max wasn't his. He never had been. That night, Jack stared at the dog tag for what felt like hours. The address etched into the metal seemed to mock him, daring him to do the right thing. Max lay beside him, his breathing slow and steady. Jack reached out, running a hand over the dog's soft fur. "You're not mine," he whispered. The words hurt more than he expected. The next morning, Jack packed the stolen jewelry into a small bag. He tied it tightly, his hands trembling. Max watched him, as if sensing that something was about to change. Jack knelt beside the dog, scratching behind his ears one last time. "We're going back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to be with them." As they set out into the cold morning, Jack felt a strange mix of relief and fear. The house loomed in the distance, its cheerful decorations a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. He didn't know what would happen when he knocked on that door, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was walking towards something instead of running away. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging with an optimism Jack couldn't yet share. Jack stood on the edge of the driveway, staring at the house he had robbed just days ago. The Christmas lights twinkled softly, casting a warm glow on the snow-covered yard. The decorations felt like an accusation, a reminder of the life he didn't belong to. Max, oblivious to Jack's inner turmoil, sat beside him, tail wagging as if nothing had changed. Jack shifted the small bag of stolen goods in his hand, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. His breath clouded in the frigid air as he tried to summon the courage to take the final steps to the door. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. He glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with unwavering trust. "You're really making this hard. You know that?" The dog barked softly, almost like encouragement, and Jack sighed. With a deep breath, he trudged through the snow toward the front porch. Each step felt like a mile, and his mind raced with possible outcomes. Would they recognize him? Call the police? Slam the door in his face? His grip tightened on the bag as he climbed the steps, his knuckles white against the cold. Jack reached the door and hesitated. For a moment, he considered turning around, running back to the warehouse, and leaving this whole mess behind. But then Max nudged his leg with his nose, a gentle push that sent an unexpected surge of determination through Jack. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Seconds felt like hours before the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 30s. He looked tired but kind, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Max sitting at Jack's side. "Max?" the man said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. He dropped to his knees, holding out his arms as the dog bounded forward, tail wagging furiously. "Max, buddy, where have you been?" Jack watched as the man embraced the dog, his own chest tightening with a strange mix of guilt and longing. He cleared his throat, drawing the man's attention. I found him wandering," Jack said, his voice hoarse. He held out the bag awkwardly. "And these two, they're yours." The man's brow furrowed as he took the bag, glancing inside. His expression shifted from confusion to realization, and Jack braced himself for the outburst, the accusations. But instead, the man looked at him with something Jack didn't expect: gratitude. "You brought him back," the man said, standing and extending a hand. "I'm Eric. Thank you." Jack stared at the offered hand, unsure of what to do. He finally shook it, the gesture foreign and uncomfortable. "I didn't. I mean, it's not like He trailed off, unable to find the words. Eric seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't press. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the warmth of the house. It's freezing out here. Come in for a minute. At least let me get you a cup of coffee. Jack hesitated, his instinct to decline, to flee. But Max was already inside, wagging his tail as two children ran into the room, squealing with joy. Jack's feet moved before his mind caught up, and he found himself stepping into the house, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The inside of the house was even cozier than it had appeared from the outside. The smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and the soft hum of Christmas music played in the background. Jack felt out of place, like an intruder in a world he didn't deserve to be in. He shifted uncomfortably as Eric disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a steaming mug. Here, Eric said, handing it to him. It's not much, but it'll warm you up. Jack took the mug reluctantly, the warmth seeping into his cold fingers. He sipped it slowly, the bitter taste grounding him. The kids were still fussing over Max, who soaked up the attention with an air of contentment. Jack couldn't help but smile slightly at the sight. So, Eric said, leaning against the counter, how'd you find him? Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He, kind of found me, actually. Followed me home. Didn't give me much choice. Eric chuckled, nodding. That sounds like Max. He's always been a people dog. We've been looking everywhere for him. The kids were heartbroken when he went missing. Jack nodded, his throat tightening. He's a good dog. They fell into an awkward silence, the only sound coming from the kids laughing as Max licked their faces. Jack finished his coffee and set the mug down on the counter. Well, I should get going. Eric frowned slightly, but he didn't push. You're welcome to stay for dinner. We've got more than enough, and it's Christmas Eve. No one should be alone tonight. The offer caught Jack off guard. He opened his mouth to refuse, but the words wouldn't come. The thought of returning to the cold, empty warehouse felt heavier than it ever had before. Finally, he nodded. I guess I could stay for a little while. Dinner was simple but warm, the kind of meal Jack hadn't had in years. The kids chattered excitedly about their Christmas plans, occasionally pausing to feed scraps to Max under the table. Eric's wife, a kind woman named Sarah, asked Jack polite questions, never prying too much. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jack felt human. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself relaxing, laughing even. He told a few stories about his childhood, carefully edited, of course, and listened as the family shared their own memories. The night passed in a blur of warmth and light, and for a fleeting moment, Jack forgot about the darkness that usually shadowed his life. When it was time to leave, Eric walked him to the door, Max at his side. I don't know what your story is, Eric said, his tone gentle, but you did a good thing tonight. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Jack nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He knelt to pet Max one last time, the dog licking his face in return. Take care of yourself, buddy, he whispered. As he stepped back into the cold night, Jack felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked away, the house growing smaller behind him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to find his way back to the light. Jack walked back to the warehouse, his breath visible in the frosty night air. The warmth of the evening lingered in his mind, a stark contrast to the cold silence awaiting him. He couldn't stop thinking about the family. Eric, Sarah, their kids, and Max. Their kindness, their laughter. The way they had welcomed him without judgment or suspicion. It was a foreign feeling, and one Jack wasn't sure he deserved. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and empty, just as he'd left it. As he stepped inside, the air felt colder than usual, the walls pressing in on him with an unfamiliar weight. Jack tossed his coat onto a broken chair and sank onto his makeshift bed. For years, this had been enough. A roof over his head, stolen goods to sell, and no one to answer to. But now, it felt hollow. The stolen jewelry he had returned had been a lifeline, but giving it back had left him with nothing except a strange sense of relief. He lay awake that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. His thoughts raced, replaying moments from the dinner. The kids feeding scraps to Max, Eric's firm handshake, Sarah's warm smile. He thought about the trust Max had shown him, following him without hesitation, as if sensing something good in Jack that even he couldn't see. The dog had been the catalyst, a reminder that even in a life full of mistakes, there was room for second chances. The following days were a blur of restlessness. Jack tried to fall back into his old habits, but they felt wrong, like putting on a coat that no longer fit. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do something more, something better. But what? He didn't have a plan, a family, or even a home. All he had was the faint echo of hope that had taken root during that one extraordinary night. One morning, as Jack wandered through the city streets, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, he spotted a community notice board outside a cafe. Among the flyers for lost pets and babysitting services, one caught his eye. * volunteers needed. Animal shelter. Help us care for animals in need. *. He stared at the flyer, the words blurring together as his mind raced. He thought of Max, of the trust in his eyes, and the way he had changed Jack's life without trying. Before he could talk himself out of it, Jack tore the flyer down and stuffed it into his pocket. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its exterior painted a cheerful yellow. Jack hesitated at the door, his fingers hovering over the handle. He wasn't used to walking into places like this, places that expected something from him. But then he remembered Max, his steady presence during those bleak days, and he pushed the door open. The woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Hi there. Can I help you?" Jack cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "I saw the flyer. About volunteering. I was wondering if you still needed help." Her smile widened. "We always need help. Do you have any experience with animals?" Jack thought of Max, of Buddy, the dog from his childhood. "A little," he said. "I had a dog when I was a kid. And another one. Recently." "That's great," she said. "We can teach you the rest. Come on, I'll show you around." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Jack helped clean kennels, feed the animals, and take the dogs out for walks. It was hard work, but it felt good, better than anything he had done in years. The animals didn't care about his past, his mistakes. They only cared that he was there, offering a kind word or a gentle touch. As the weeks went by, Jack found himself spending more and more time at the shelter. He started to recognize the dogs by name, learning their quirks and personalities. The staff, once strangers, became familiar faces, greeting him with warmth and gratitude. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he was part of something larger than himself. One afternoon, as Jack was walking a scruffy terrier named Daisy, he heard a familiar bark. He turned to see Max bounding toward him, his tail wagging furiously. Behind him, Eric and his kids followed, waving as they approached. Jack's heart leapt at the sight of them. "Hey, stranger," Eric said, smiling. "We heard you were volunteering here. Thought we'd stop by and say hi." Jack scratched Max behind the ears, grinning as the dog licked his face. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eric clapped him on the shoulder. "We owe you a lot, Jack. Bringing Max back to us, everything you did. It meant the world. And now, seeing you here, helping other animals, it's good to see you doing well." Jack shrugged. Looking down at Max, "He taught me a lot," he said quietly. "More than I ever expected." The kids hugged Jack, thanking him again for bringing Max home. And for the first time in years, Jack felt a genuine sense of pride. When they left, Max looked back at Jack one last time, his tail wagging as if to say goodbye. That night, Jack sat in the quiet of the shelter, thinking about how far he had come. He still didn't have much, no home, no family of his own. But he had found a purpose, a way to give back. The shelter had become his refuge, a place where he could start to rebuild the pieces of his life. As Christmas approached again, Jack hung a small stocking in the corner of the shelter's break room. It wasn't much, but it felt symbolic, a reminder of where he had been and where he was going. The other volunteers laughed, teasing him about his newfound holiday spirit, but Jack didn't mind. For the first time, the season felt like something worth celebrating. On Christmas Eve, as the city settled into quiet, Jack walked through the shelter one last time, checking on the animals. He stopped by Daisy's kennel, giving her a pat on the head, then moved to the others, offering soft words of reassurance. As he walked back to the break room, he paused by the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets. The night was still, the kind of stillness that carried a sense of possibility. Jack smiled to himself, his breath fogging the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a thief, a failure, or an outsider. He felt like someone who had found his way home. And all it had taken was a dog, a family's kindness, and a little faith in the power of second chances. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.